biologists per se. So basically, I think that when we understand history, we understand why things are done the way they are done today. So we are going to go through history and why they arrived to the point that fractionation became the standard of care in radiation oncology. Then we are going to discuss a little bit, that's the hardest part of the lecture, about the mechanistic models of cell survival, and then go through some concepts that are currently normally used in the setting of radiation oncology and radiosurgery, discuss the 4 R's of fractionation, and finally finish with some examples of clinical applications of these concepts. So just to review a little bit what happens upon delivery of ionizing radiation, basically the very first step is the physical step, followed by the chemical, which means ionizing radiation hits the cell and leads to the DNA damage. And all of this occurs in less than 1 second. Now, the DNA can be repaired or misrejoined, that will lead to cell death. And this process takes from 1 second to a few hours, at the most 6 hours. But the clinical results, that's what we are used to see. That's what we deal with. Those will occur depending on the type of tissue. But in the case of the brain, it's going to happen late. It's going to happen only months to years after radiation was delivered. And it can go in different paths. Either the radiation is going to kill the cell, or it will induce some mutation that can make the cell more dangerous, so it's carcinogenesis. And also you need to take into account the early and delayed side effects of radiation into the normal tissues. So here I'm just showing an example of the ionizing radiation hitting the DNA and breaking the two-strand break, and this is pretty much lethal to the cell. Now, how does radiation act into the cell, leading to death? So there are 2 major pathways for that, and so the first one, the simple one, the direct one, is the radiation hits the DNA inside the cell, breaks it, and the cell dies. That's direct. Now, probabilistically speaking, there is only 1 DNA per cell. So even though it's a very effective way to hit and kill the cell, it's not as likely to occur as it is to hit other molecules inside the cell that are more abundant, that will lead to the second, to indirect pathway for cell death. So, for instance, the majority of the component of a cell is water from the weight standpoint. So the probability that the radiation will hit water and not DNA at first is much higher. But once it hits water, it's going to generate free radicals. The most common one is the hydroxyl radical that is very active and will interact then with the DNA and cause DNA damage. So this is the indirect route, but also leads to lethal damage to the cell. And that's pretty much what we are seeing here. The direct route through hitting the water molecule, or the direct damage to the DNA per se. Now, let's come back in time and understand why things were made the way they were. So in the late years of the 19th century, radiation was discovered. First by the X-ray, then the word radioactivity was actually first put in the literature by Marie Curie, and the Curies discovered the radioactivity materials and were able to isolate. And it didn't take long for this to be used in clinical practice. So only 4 years later, actually, there were some applications of these recently discovered materials into medicine, mainly in the setting of skin cancer. And at that time, nothing was known. So what they did, and they used for the first initial 2 decades of the 20th century, the massive dose technique. So it's just you go and you deliver a high dose of radiation to a very large area of the body. Obviously, the complications triggered by this approach were unacceptable, and this technique actually subsided, and the fractionation appeared as a better option In the early 20th, experimental work, and for the first time, the use of fractionation in the setting of head and neck cancer showed that there was a therapeutic advantage. So they did achieve relatively same levels of tumor control, but at the cost of less complications. And it wasn't until the 40s that actually the first ISO effect curves were published, and we are going to go through this, what is an ISO effect curve. So that leads to the conclusion that during fractionation, something was happening that was different. Some biological processes were occurring that led to fractionation to be an interesting option and to be advantageous in comparison to single massive dose of radiation. So in this sense, fractionation was born. Now, how can you, so they went on to study what was going on. And the mechanistic models of cell survival came up. There are many different models in the literature. The most popular one is the linear quadratic model. And I'm going to discuss just one more with you, the single hit multi-target model. They are very similar models except by one difference. But what's important to keep in mind, because I'll come back to this point when we discuss radiosurgery, is that these two models were based on in vitro cell cultures, and they were measuring only cell survival. That's the only thing they were evaluating. And cell survival or cell kill was evaluated by two different mechanisms. First, the single hit, the lethal damage that happens immediately upon radiation delivery. That's what we discussed before. And the multi-target or multiple sublethal damages that once accumulated will lead to a lethal outcome or cell death. And we are going to see this here. So I know it sounds complicated, but basically this green line here is the linear quadratic model. The yellow line is the single hit multi-target model. And what we are seeing here is the very popular, I'm sure everybody already heard about, the alpha-beta ratio. So the alpha is the representation of the linear portion of the curve into the linear quadratic model. And the beta represents the quadratic component of the formula. That's what it is. So you have a straight line and followed by a quadratic component. So it's a downward bend curve as higher doses of radiations are delivered to the cell culture. What's the difference with the single hit multi-target model is that the first portion of the curve is pretty much similar, and it does reflect the immediate and effective lethal damage of radiation. So single hit lethal damage, that's the first portion of the curve. And as you come, and this portion is also linear at high doses ranges of radiation, that reflects the sum of multiple sublethal damages that will lead at last to cell death. Just to make a note, so this is log of survival of cells, and this is radiation dose. So that said, these are the two differences, and the linear quadratic model became more used in clinical practice because the math is much easier to handle for the radiation oncologists, and also it allows a linear additivity of the biological equivalent dose. And this is very easy to understand and very important to apply in practice. And I'm going to come back to this definition in a little bit. So just coming back to the linear quadratic model, we see here that actually it's modeling different types of tissues. It depends on the alpha-beta ratio for acute responding tissues. They have high alpha-beta ratio. What we observe here is that radiation-induced reactions occur earlier in time, as we can see here. So the actinic reaction in the skin shortly after, for instance, whole brain radiation therapy for brain metastasis. So that happens because a larger amount of cells are killed in a shorter time frame upon radiation delivery. And what happens about late responding tissues? That's what matters to us, neurosurgeons. The most classical example of a late responding tissue is the brain, the spinal cord. There is they have a low alpha-beta ratio, the late responding tissues. And this curve is showing that actually when you start to see a more significant cell death, it's later in time. That's why when we deliver radiosurgery, we are going to see complications only months to years after radiation treatment, in opposite to fast or acute responding tissues. So the fractionation allows for a differential sparing of the different types of tissues. So these are the two curves we just discussed, the acute responding to single fraction and the late responding to single fraction. Now we see that as we fractionate, we actually lose somewhat effectiveness in regards to cell killing. But what do we gain with that? If you can see here, that's what we lose in terms of cell killing for acute responding tissues. And that's what we gain when we are fractionating late responding tissues. That's the case of the brain. So basically, fractions improve the therapeutic ratio. Here is an unfavorable therapeutic ratio. For us to get to kill this amount of cells in an acute responding tissue, for instance, tumor, will trigger a lot of side effects in the normal brain. Now, if you fractionate, we gain. So that's important. That's why fractionated showed better results in the early decades of the 20th century. And this is a favorable rate. So I mentioned to you I would discuss the biological effective dose concept. So it's a very practical, and radiation oncologists and neurosurgeons who deal with this we use this a lot. So it allows the quantification of the radiobiological effects and allows comparison of different schemes of radiation, different regimens. Therefore, you can actually compare one approach to another. And that's why the linear quadratic model gained a lot of popularity. As you can see here, the relationship is a linear relationship, so it's easy to understand and apply in clinic. So each of these curves reflects the effective survival curve using a given dose of radiation. And as you can see, according to the size of the dose per fraction, you have a different biological equivalent dose. So for this size of fraction, dose of radiation delivered in one fraction of radiation, you have more or less biological effect. And that chart actually showing to us what is the impact of the fraction size or the fraction dose into the biological systems. And finally, how do we translate this principle into practice? As I mentioned to you, we have 1 century of experience with low-dose fractionated course of radiation. Then we come to this crazy idea of radiosurgery, single blasting high dose or hypofractionation. How can we put that into context of the knowledge that was accumulated over centuries? So you can actually use the biological equivalence dose to reference point that can be any scheme. So in this example here, we are using to the 2 Gray fractions. That's the full fractionation course classically reported. So how do we treat brain metastasis, for instance? We usually deliver 18 Gray, and if you project to the alpha beta curve, that's the brain, low alpha beta curve, we will be giving, if we were fractionating, a blasting dose of 90 Gray. So that's a very high dose of radiation. We know we are able to kill tumoral cells with such a high dose. So we apply that for the single dose treatment of brain metastasis. What about acoustic neuromas? So those are benign, slow growing tumors. We do have the nerves passing inside the tumor. So when we deliver radiation, you're also delivering radiation to already somewhat damaged nerve that's running into the tumor. We don't need to give a blasting dose, and usually we do treat, modern times we treat with 12 Gray, and that would correspond to a fractionation of 45 Gray. That's very standard and very mild fractionation. And why do we fractionate here? Because we already showed that once you fractionate, we are protecting late responding tissues. In this case, we want to protect the nerves running inside the tumor. In case of larger tumors, we want to minimize the effect of radiation into the surrounding brain. So it makes good sense to fractionate. And with full fractionation course, so we do stereotatic fractionation. So we are very precise to the lesion, but we do full course of fractionation. Some other places they just use single dose, or some other places they do use hypofractionation. But based on radiobiological basis, it makes more sense to full fractionate, because then we are better sparing the nerves inside the tumor. And with that, in our series here, we have 92% of hearing preservation with this approach. And finally, we know that the optic apparatus is very sensitive to radiation. And we use the threshold dose of no more than 8 gray, touching a point of the optic apparatus for single dose radiation. And that will be the equivalent to 20 gray in fraction, so very low dose. So that's how we use this approach, the concept of biological effective dose in the context of different schemes. So the therapeutic ratio, very simple to understand. It's a balance between normal tissue complication probability and tumor control probability. And this tumor control can be seen, for instance, as AVM obliteration probability in case of benign lesions. Now, fractionation works. And why does fractionation work? There are 4 major phenomena that are happening during the course of fractionation, and we are going to discuss each one of them. So the very first one is actually repair. We discussed that when radiation hits the cell, we can observe different kinds of damages. The milder one is the base damage. So the DNA glycosylases will come first, followed by the DNA polymerases, and finally by the DNA ligases, and repair the cell. When the damage is a little bit more extensive, including the base plus the sugar phosphate backbone, another setting of enzymes come into scene to trigger repair. Then we can have single strand break DNA, and finally the lethal lesion, the double strand break DNA. And but even the double strand break DNA, the cell still tries to repair it, but it's not successful on that task. So here we see that the double strand break, the cell will try to repair and recruit different DNA enzymes. According to the amount of damage, it will go straight to apoptosis by recruitment of activation of p53 pathway. If the cell sees that there is still room for some kind of survival, the p21 that's related to cell survival pathway is activated, and the cell will arrest under different moments of the cell cycle. And this will have an importance. That's why I'm putting this slide here. I know it's a lot of details. Now, if there is single strand break of the DNA, a different setting of enzymes is recruited, and the phosphorylation of different enzymes, depending on which kind of gene is activated, the cell will arrest in G2 or mitosis phases or S phase. But the fact is that lots of this sublethal damage will actually lead to cell death. But after one single fraction of radiation, that's the repair that happens. And that justifies why we lose effectiveness as we fractionate more in terms of cell killing efficiency. So all this happens actually within 2 to 6 hours from radiation. And this is just a mathematical observation, but the linear quadratic model actually assumes that there is complete repair in between fractions. They happen every 24 hours, and the repair is within 6 hours at the most. And there is a little bit more complications to this. It's an assumption. So, but what is important also to bring in mind is that our intuitive concept of cell death is irreversible cessation of vital functions. But into radiobiological context, that's not what's the goal, and that's not what radiation biologists consider cell death. That means loss of clonogenic integrity. or the cell is not unable, it is not able to keep on proliferating indefinitely. That's what means cell death. And the cell may still be visible, metabolic intact, even undergo some few mitosis before death. So I explained to you that there is repair, and that's what we are seeing here. This is the most effective way to kill a cell, is a single blasting dose of radiation. That's the most effective. Now, depending on the situation, we are not allowed to do that because of the complications in the normal tissue. So we go for fractions. But our neurosurgeon brains tend to think that 2 times 6 is 12, as well as 4 times 3 is 12. So why is this so complicated and different? So it's not a linear addiction of the dose per fraction when we go for fractionation. So what we're seeing here, for instance, 2 times 6 is this line yellow here. So the ISO effect of this scheme of fractionation when compared to a single dose is much mild. It's milder in comparison to 4 times 3. That's what we have here. And when you project the final outcome into logarithmic cell death or survival function of the cell and compare the different levels of equivalence, that's what we call the ISO effect. So this shoulder that we see here in the curves, as we add fractions of radiation, this shoulder is where we lose efficiency in terms of cell kill. And it does reflect mathematically the repair event that we discussed before. So first R was taken care. The second R is reoxygenation. What happens when we are irradiating a tumor that has hypoxia or necrosis into the center? Actually, the hypoxia cells are way more radiation resistant. So as we fractionate, we reoxygenate the tumor, and then we gain inability to now transform the hypoxic cell into a normoxic cell, and there increase our capability to kill that cell. And this is just an example of a glioma, and we know here is in an anoxic center. And as we kill the cells here by adding different fractions, we will reoxygenate the cells here. And what's the mathematical description of that? So you can see here the effectiveness of the same dose of radiation and how much cell death it leads to, or the amount of cells surviving, extremely high in comparison to the same dose given to normoxic cells. The other R is redistribution. That's why I showed that slide where when according to the level of DNA damage, the cells are going to go arresting different cell cycles. So the first mechanism when the cell feels the damage from radiation is cell arrest. So it can repair DNA damage and hopefully come back to proliferate. So the most radiation sensitive cells are within the late G2 and mitosis phase. That's what we are seeing here. That's when ideally you want all the cells to be when you deliver radiation. And the most radiation resistant portion of the cell cycle is the S phase. So when we fraction, we give time for the cell to be cycling, and hopefully during the fractionation course, the cell will be in the phase that radiation is more effective to trigger cell death. And the final R is repopulation. And Dr. Wieters here, who is the former chairman of radiation oncology, first described this in the literature for head and neck tumors, and it was followed by others that applied the same principle for other tumors. But it's a very actually simple concept to understand. So they just did look at the probability of local tumor control at a given dose of radiation in fractions. And as they vary the length of fractions, the tumor control dropped dramatically. So fractionation is good. You give time for the cell to reoxygenate, for redistribution of cell cycle. But if you fractionate too much, you're going to actually lose power. Why? Because the tumor cells is more active than the normal cell in the case of the brain. So there is a point that you have an inverse of this effect. So they actually, it's believed to have a downregulation of the apoptosis into the tumor cells, and then you lose efficacy of fractionation. So basically, Dr. Witter's law, summarizing the classical radiation knowledge, was to give as high dose as possible without causing severe late effects, using a smaller dose per fraction in order to keep the late effects moderate comparing to cell killing, but give this dose as short and overall time as possible without causing severe late effects. So what was what are the principles that we are going to comment later on that he was predicting? So give as high dose as you can. This is radiosurgery. And in a shorter overall period, the shortest one you can, that's hypofractionation in stereotactic radiotherapy. And now, more recently, it was expanded throughout the body, which means stereotactic body radiation therapy. So we start a new era in the history of radiation. Here we are in the beginning of the 50s, when a neurosurgeon had a surgical mind to use radiation as a surgical tool, and he coined the term radiosurgery. So he was already using a principle that was well known from the radiobiology standpoint. But it took a surgeon to come into the field to allow the development of methods that could come back to the use of the very first principle of radiation. And as you can see here, this was the very first patient treated in history with radiosurgery. And it's a very, very rudimentary radiosurgery device. It's an orthogonal X-ray tube attached to the arc-centered, the Lexell arc-centered frame, and he treated actually a trigeminal neuralgia patient. Lexell was pretty much interested on causing necrosis, blasting high dose and causing lesions without the need to open the skull. So he was a stereotactic surgeon. He was used to do this with radiofrequency, with cryo. So he just wanted to do this without opening the skull. First envisioned this application mainly for psychiatric indications. So that's what he was targeting at, and how did that develop. So after that, the Bragg peak in the protons was discovered, and the Bragg peak allows a very precise delivery of the radiation. After that, and that's how Lexell started actually radiosurgery. But he did use the proton facility in Uppsala, which was a city that was 60 miles from the hospital where he was, so it was very inconvenient. And he started to think about a device that would be easier, that wouldn't require all the infrastructure that a cyclotron does. And he ended up developing the gamma unit, and the first patient was treated with gamma knife in the late 1968, and it was for a pain indication, for a thalamarotomy. So after that, in Buenos Aires, some years later, Betty was able to adapt a regular linear accelerator with the stereotatic methodology to be very precise, and that made radiosurgery very available to the world at a very low cost in comparison to the other options. And finally here at UCLA, the Novalis system shaped beam came, and it was the first place in the world where the system was used. And also development on this equipment to become what it is today, the Novalis TX. Much of this work was made here. So I just want to bring another concept for you. Now we are very fancy on how we deliver focused radiation. One of the modalities is the so-called intensity modulation. What is that? That's a 4-dimension modulation of the beam. We modulate the beam in time and space. For instance, the classical indication for that is a donut-shaped lesion. We know that the organ at risk, the cord, is at the center of this. How can we shape to cover the tumor without giving blasting doses to the cord? So according to the position of the gantry in relation to the tumor, we modulate. Under this position, we are going to deliver more radiation to this point, less radiation to here. And it goes rotating until it gives the prescription dose that you want to the target. And as the gantry and the linear accelerator rotates, it goes changing the leaves of the collimators, and it's going to distribute different doses according to time and space. That's the principle of intensity modulation. Another application is on actually treatment of multiple brain lesions. In this case, all these brain metastases are being treated as one isocenter at once, instead of treating each one of them. So you do save a lot of time. It's more challenging from the physical standpoint, technological standpoint, but in practice it's very, very appealing. And besides this, there is even the rapid arc that's able to do what the intensity modulation does, but within 2 to 3 minutes. While in intensity modulation, average treatment time is about 12 to 15 minutes. It's still very fast, but the rapid arc is even faster. So with all this coming up, where are we? We have exquisite physics, high precision, dosimetry. We are able to, this is a rapid arc plan. See what we can do today. We can just irradiate a skull-based sarcoma without delivering radiation to the brain. So we are very actually virtuosistic on how we can deliver this. And this will help with normal tissue sparing and boost the dose to the lesion. But how are we in regards to radiobiological knowledge? We are lagging behind. So we don't know the effects of inhomogeneous dose distribution. Everything I discussed with you is assuming that the entire organ is receiving a homogeneous dose and it's being completely irradiated. But here, in the case of a spinal lesion, the cord, just a portion of the cord is getting an inhomogeneous dose. That's the fall off of the radiation. So how does that interfere with the cell kill survival log? How does it interfere with normal tissue complication? We still don't know. And now, which models can we use to predict and compare what we are doing into this context of radiosurgery and mainly hypofractionation? For instance, an AVM in a very eloquent area is here. We are modernly using multimodality approach to try to map as the best we can the organs at risk. And we do use inverse planning. That's inverse planning is no more than the counterintuitive way of planning with intensity modulation that's computer generated. And here we see that we are using all this technology with the goal to decrease normal tissue complication while keeping an effective dose to obliterate the AVM. Here is another example of where we are using this. And I just put this case here to show how a patient can benefit from the development of the techniques. So he was treated from brain metastasis with radiosurgery. And he was able to survive for almost 6-7 years when spine radiosurgery came into scene. And he also benefited from this modality of treatment. Hadn't he been treated before and survived this phase of his disease, he wouldn't benefit there at the time. So I mentioned to you about the linear quadratic and the single hit multi-target models. And I asked you to pay attention that it was modeling only cell survival and in vitro cell cultures. Now, how does that predict high doses per fraction of radiation? For that, we actually recently was published the universal survival curve. It's a mathematical model, and actually what these authors did, they just combined the linear component of the linear quadratic model to the multi-target component. That's the second part of the curve of the single hit multi-target model. So they got two pieces of each model and put it together and came up with a formula to give birth to this curve here. It's not that complicated. And why is that? Because the linear quadratic model was based on low doses of radiation, up to 80 gray. And here we are treating with one single dose of 18. So it's really bad to predict radiation killing at high doses of radiation, especially above 13 gray. And here's just the representation of what I said. So the linear quadratic model, because there is this downward bending of the curve, actually tends to overestimate the cell killing from the high radiation doses. So keep that in mind. This is only in regards to cell survival mechanism. At low doses, that's the only mechanism that's occurring. But when we go to high doses of radiation, cell kill is one of the events, but there is also vasculature and stromal damage to the cell. And vasculature damage doesn't happen in low doses. That's why we fractionate, to protect vasculature. But in the setting of high doses, there is this effect. So what happens? Here we see this publication actually contesting the use of the linear quadratic model into the radiosurgery setting. And this curve shows actually the survival function or vascular damage. This one is the cytotoxic damage that we know, and it's predicted in the linear quadratic model. And when you add all this up, actually you end up to see the linear quadratic model actually underestimates cell kill when you are applying high dose per fraction of radiation or high dose of radiosurgery. Taking that in account, and now the harder portion has passed, so hopefully it will be smoother from here to the end. So what do we know about doses and irradiation to the vasculature? We know from laboratory studies here done at UCLA by Dr. DeSales using the pig model and the neurointerventional team, always helped by Eric, that there is linear correlation between time of obliteration of an AVM and dose that's delivered. We also know that there is a logarithmic correlation between dose of radiation given and odds of obliteration, and that's based on the Swedish data. So we know that if we give as high dose as possible, we will achieve more obliteration in a shorter period of time. And what is going on there? And that's the histology of one of the animals used. So the obliteration actually occurs because there is smooth cell proliferation, endothelial proliferation, and accumulation of collagen type 4. And what about the spine? How can we treat the spine? And we have treated some spinal AVMs, and we see actually that the same dose principles you use in the treatment of brain AVMs apply to spine AVMs. Here you can see one of the results. Now, one aspect is tumor control probability on AVMs or AVM obliteration. The other side of the coin is normal tissue complication. What happens? There are two things that predict complications when treated AVMs with radiosurgery. One, there is a dose constraint. Every time you deliver a high dose, 12 gray, to more than 10 cc of tissue, including AVM plus the normal brain, you are incurring a higher chance of getting some kind of complication. So that's the limitation. On the other hand, so you decrease the dose because you don't want to violate this constraint. But as the AVM increases in size and you respect this, you are going to end up giving a very ineffective dose to treat an AVM that's larger than 4 centimeters. So we have a problem here. What if it's a small AVM? We know radiosurgery is extremely effective to treat. But what about a giant AVM? Can we do anything with radiation in that regards? And here's just the graphic to show to you. So what we know is that we cannot give a single blasting dose that's effective to trigger obliteration. On the other hand, if we fractionate, we are not going to go anywhere. So the option is to hypofractionate, and that's what we decided to do with the giant AVMs here in this institution. And we recently published the results on 24 cases that were treated like this. Our hypofractionation scheme is to a total dose of 25 or 30 gray. And this is just one of the results. So this is a large AVM, volume, 6 centimeters in the major diameter, treated with 30 gray, so 6 gray in 5 fractions. And the 3 years follow-up showing is still a small residual with a high flow fistula. And this massive giant AVM actually became now a radiosurgery target. It became amenable to be treated with high blasting single dose, and indeed this patient was retreated, showing that we were safe, but can we be more effective? Can we trigger complete obliteration with fractions without the need to wait long periods of time and repeating radiation? So because of that, there is, and because nobody knows what's the final answer to that, a group from Andrew's group is proposed this prospective trial where they did actually irradiate the patients. They increased 2 grays per day and added 1 fraction. So they were comparing what we have, 30 gray versus 42 gray total dose. And they did see a major increase in the odds of obliteration. So they were able to obliterate giant AVMs in 83% of the cases within 2 years. At which cost? As you can see, they had only 7 patients in this group. So massive normal tissue damage. And this patient actually died, and they stopped the trial. So we know 30, from our experience, is not very effective to be a definitive treatment. It's more like a stepwise to do something unmanageable for surgery or for radiosurgery. But if we increase and we improve effectiveness to that much, we know it's too much. So where is the best therapeutic ratio for hypofractionation? That's where we are still lagging behind in biological knowledge and equivalence doses into the curves. So that's what I just said. So we don't know what's the biological effective dose for this kind of hypofractionation. We do have a very precise information on the physical dose that we actually deliver to the tissue, but the biological effect we don't know. And it's important to notice that for late responding tissues as the brain, the dose per fraction of radiation is very, very important, even more so than the total length of fractionation. Because of this, that's the gain that we have, as I already discussed with you before. So I'll just now go through some clinical applications and the lecture. So brain metastasis, how do we think? What do we do? So usually they are malignant cells, so they do need high doses of radiation to control tumor growth. The metastases that are candidates for radiosurgery are usually small lesions. Therefore, you don't have problems with the 12 grade 10 cc constraint, because later on this constraint was shown to be also applied to non-AVM tumors. So you don't have issues with that. You don't have issues with a need to reoxygenate because it's a small lesions. Usually they're not necrotic. So you can pretty much go with the green line and be successful in the treatment of these lesions. Just an example. What about the context of benign tumors? And I'm going to just mention one histology, that's pituitary adenoma. In this case, the patient refused surgery. We absolutely have surgery in all the patients before they undergo any kind of radiation. But in this case, the tumor is touching the optic apparatus. I showed to you that the radiation dose tolerance of the optic is very, very limited. So fractionation seems to be a good choice because we will protect the eloquent normal tissue surrounding the lesion. Besides, it's not a malignant lesion that requires a blasting dose to control. It's relatively more slow proliferating in comparison to malignant tumors. So we are going to do full fractionation using stereotatic technique. And what about malignant gliomas? That's a different setting of lesions. Here you see that there is hypoxic cells. Therefore, fractionation is somewhat attractive to take care of this. On the other hand, if you really want to ablate because it's acute proliferating tissue, you need to give a blasting dose of radiation. But you are prohibited because of usually the volume of the lesion at recurrence when these patients come to radiation, or because of the eloquence of the location of this tumor. So this is interesting, but you usually cannot do. And if you go multiple fractions thinking on reoxygenation, you end up shooting your own foot because then you incur in the issue of accelerated repopulation of the tumor. So you are pretty much given the possibility of hypofractionate. So you give still a high dose of radiation, but you do protect the normal tissue somehow. And the other modern concept that came up was the dose painting. So very, very inhomogeneous dose distribution. And the idea is that you are going to deliver higher doses of radiation to the regions of the tumor that are more radiation resistant. For instance, we know that hypoxic cells are more resistant. So you can get a boost there without incurring toxicity in the surrounding tissue. So all these fancy mechanisms of radiation delivered failed. Radiosurgery boost followed by conventional radiation failed to improve survival. Stereotatic radiotherapy boost also failed. We still do it here in selected cases only, but as a widespread application also failed. Why? And I think the main problem in the context of gliomas is that we have a very precise and fancy way to deliver radiation, but we don't know to where. We don't have a precise and objective delineation of the target. So you are precise, but to what? It's not contrast enhancing. So this paper from Dr. Grozu, it's a small series retrospective where she did actually compared the irradiation to the same dose in gliomas that were defined by contrast enhancing plus methionine PET versus just contrast enhancing. And somewhat surprisingly, she did find survival benefit. So basically, we need to think how we can mark clonogenesis within the gliomas, because we do have the apparatus to deliver a high dose to that area, but we still don't see the area to be able to fully take advantage of the technology that we do have in hands. Now, in regards to spinal cord, that's a new area inside the stereotatic radiation, and we still don't know what's the normal tissue complication for the cord. We recently started irradiating the cord. We know that the benign lesions in the spine do respond to the very same doses we use in the brain. For instance, a neurofibroma will respond to 12 gray as we treat acoustic neuromas in the brain. Spinal AVM, the same thing. To control spinal metastasis, we do need preferably doses higher than 14, 16, 18 gray. We are not treating all of them with 18 gray because we don't know how much the cord is going to tolerate. And we have some data coming up from experimental work, mainly from Pomedin, because he does use the same clinical device and dose distribution that we use in clinical practice. That's why his experiments are so ready to be understood and applicable to clinical practice. So what did he find? He did find that actually probably the cord tolerance curve is very, very steep. So at a dose point of 17.4 gray, you have a 1% probability of myelopathy induced by radiation. If you raise from 17.4 to 18.6, you already increase to 10% possibility. And if you increase only 3 gray to 20 gray, you have 50%. That's the ED50 that the radiation oncologists talk about, of triggering that. Now, unfortunately, the confidence intervals are very large because this is animal data, and he had only 4 animals per group. So, but that's where we are heading to. So we know that the changing point for triggering complications is around 17, maybe 16, or 18 gray to the cord. And we know this is the dose that's effective to handle malignant tumors, such as spinal metastasis. Now, I want to share with you our single case of radiation-induced myelitis after radiosurgery. This is a 59-year-old gentleman that actually had a sarcoma with a C4 met from the sarcoma. And as you can see here, this is the dose volume histogram of the tumor. As I mentioned to you, before we know physically what we are delivering to the tumor. And actually, it's a very good DVH, showing here that 100% of the tumor is basically covered by 99.8 dose, or this is the 100% dose. That's the prescription dose. In this case, we treated with 14 gray. So the whole tumor is receiving the prescription dose of radiation. That's what this curve here is showing to us. In the conformity index, the best conformity index, the ideal conformity index means tumor is covered in 100% and normal tissue surrounding it does not receive any of the prescription dose. So it's ideal. It's what, in this case, we got 0.98. So very good tumor coverage. But let's look at the DVH of the spinal cord. Actually, the ideal one would be if it was 0. So it would be just a curve like this. I mean, in reality, it doesn't happen. So that's the lesion, and that's the radiation-induced myelopathy that was observed at 17, continued at 18 months. The patient was put in, this is T1 with GAD. The patient was put in steroids, didn't respond not to pentoxifylline, and finally he was treated with hyperbaric, 26 sections, and he did recover somewhat of the deficit. He was wheelchair bounded, and he was grade 3 to going towards grade 4 at last follow-up 6 months ago. So the radiation, the cord here actually did receive the prescription dose, but to a very minimal volume of the cord. It was to a dose point to the cord, but did receive the 14 gray. And we saw from POS data that actually there the triggering point was 17, so higher than what we actually observed in our clinical case. But we need to think that experimental world is perfect. The pig is anesthetized, does not move. Here we have an alive patient. We do have the tracking system, the exact track to monitor for movement and to correct. But it's different than the experimental setting. So, and what about the future? So we discussed a lot in the context of oncology, but what is the future in this field? So as we learn more how to use radiation to modulate brain function, and this is where neurosurgeons are going to be the unique ones pushing the field again. And we shouldn't just take the approach that, okay, now we are frameless, they don't need the frame, they are taking over, we are not part of this, now they are using the same principles to the liver, to the pancreas, we are out of the loop. We are not. Again, I think history will repeat itself as neurosurgeons will bring new lights and new approaches of this technique into the field. For instance, we still can use the very old concept of Lexell when he first started radiation. That's a precise, very focused lesion. For instance, in the treatment of psychosurgery, we're not there yet because we haven't refined the targeting with the deep brain stimulator. That's a reversible technique. But once this is done, I think radiosurgery has good future on this field, because we know that these patients require a lot of energy in their generators. They are young. They are changing their generators every 1.5 years. And besides, Are they reliable to check the battery to come for follow-up? So if you can really locate where is the sweet spot and make a definitive lesion, you are doing well for this case. The other possibility is to modulate pain by delivering a calculated damage to the nerve by leading to demyelination, as we can see here in the histology. This is the intact nerve, and upon radiation you see some demyelination, but not complete destruction of the nerve. Otherwise, we're going to trigger neuropathic pain. That's something we don't want. But by giving this, leading to this amount of demyelination, we are actually changing the dorsal root reflex, leading to pain in this setting of patients. And finally, can we use low doses of radiation to modulate neurotransmitter in the brain? Is that going to be a restorative application, or it's going to be a transient increase or a palliative increase of neurotransmitters? We don't know, but even if it's transient, it's something that's worth pursuing. So here I just want to thank you mainly to Antonio and Dr. Selch for everything I have learned during here in the program. We do have 3 very knowledgeable radiation biologists at UCLA, and I want to thank Dr. Lee, because I don't know how many times I have seen his lecture on radiation biology, and he has taught me a lot about it. And this is the experimental team. I didn't have time to go over all the experiments done here in developing radiobiological models, but it's worth it to mention because they were also part of the bulk of the knowledge that I showed. And in case you are really interested in seeing some formulas and going deeper into the mathematical models, I would recommend that you go to the book, chapter 6, page 61. And you can have a lot of fun seeing more details of radiobiology in this book that just came out 2 months ago, and it was edited by the UCLA group. Thank you.